Pacifica, California. March 12, 1977. That night, the Pacific Ocean was cold and restless waves crashing against the base of Devil's Slide, white foam spraying and vanishing into the dark. The coastal highway twisted and turned deserted except for the sweep of patrol lights cutting across the wet guardrails. Teresa Corwin buttoned her uniform jacket tighter, her brown hair tugged loose by the ocean wind. She set her shift log on the passenger seat, adjusted the radio handset, and touched the grip of her sidearm, the practiced motions of a young deputy barely 26. She pulled out from the San Pedro Valley lot, ordered to make one last sweep along Cabrillo Highway. The red and blue flash of her Plymouth Fury rippled faintly over the black water below the shadow of the cliffs, stretching long and jagged. The dashboard clock ticked past 2:12 a.m. A stiff gust swept through the line of pines, rattling the metal guardrail. Teresa eased into the tight curve, her eyes cutting briefly left where Devil's Slide rose above her like the spine of a sleeping beast. On her night log, she'd already written the line Checkpoint 4 clear. But no one ever heard her call in from Checkpoint 5. The shift room's clock kept ticking through the dawn light, spilling gold across the cliffs. But on Cabrillo Highway, Teresa's patrol car never came back. And from that night on, no one ever saw her again. By dawn, Devil's Slide was bathed in pale gold, the slate-gray Pacific glowing with faint streaks of light. The morning wind cut across the roadside grass, rattling the crime scene tarps strung up along the cliff's edge. Teresa's Plymouth Fury wasn't at the San Pedro lot. In the watch office, her shift log lay open pen, resting on the corner of the desk, but the line for Checkpoint 5 was still blank. At 7 a.m., the official search began. A long stretch of Cabrillo Highway was cordoned off with yellow tape patrol cars lined the shoulder, their lights still flashing. Officers in worn jackets spread maps out over the hoods of their cars, marking off sectors, breaking into teams to sweep the cliffs. One by one, they edged down the road, peering over the jagged drop. Below, the silver waves struck the base of the rocks, foam dissolving as quickly as it appeared. A technician crouched near the guardrail, his eyes narrowing. There, faint on the mossy stone, were streaks of white paint, faint but unmistakable, like tire marks or an impact. But there was no wreckage, no broken glass, no scattered lights. By midday, the wind from the water grew sharper, and fine rain swept across the cliffs. The makeshift command tent flapped in the breeze, loose pages of notes rustling. Michael Corwin, Teresa's husband, arrived, then walking alongside her frail mother in a cream sweater. They were stopped just behind the tape, watching the patrol cars lined up and the search teams moving methodically along the edge. Michael's eyes were empty, his hand clenching the damp shift log someone had handed him, the cover warped from mist. By late afternoon, the search extended into the waters below the cliffs. A rescue boat circled the rocky outcrop, but the churning surf erased everything. One officer stepped out of the tent, tore a sheet from his clipboard, and pinned it to the post, missing Teresa Corwin. Unit 46. Last seen, March 12, 1977, 021 T-Shars. The rough letters stared back at everyone who passed. As the sun dipped behind the Santa Cruz Mountains, Cabrillo Highway fell quiet again. The evening traffic hummed, as if no young deputy had disappeared from the road the night before. No body, no wreck, no note. Only the cold ocean still crashing against the shore, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath. 13 years had passed. Time had worn even the sharpest pain down to a quiet scar. Teresa Corwin's photograph had long since been taken down from the bulletin board at the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office. The missing persons flyer folded into a cold case file, her name just another line lost in the archives, like the cliff that swallowed her that night. But Devil's Slide hadn't changed, still cold, still treacherous. On a June morning in 1990, a Caltrans crew set up barriers along Cabrillo Highway to prepare for lane expansion. Drills hammered against old concrete chunks, breaking loose and tumbling toward the rocky drop below. One of the crane operators halted when he caught sight of something wedged among the boulders, a twisted frame streaked with moss, faintly glinting gray through the morning fog. A steel cable was lowered and hooked to it. Slowly, the wreck was hauled up over the edge. The battered Plymouth Fury patrol car emerged, rust clinging to its body paint, faded to dull silver windows, shattered rear axle broken. Along its flank, barely visible through years of grime, still read, Unit 46. Police arrived quickly, stringing yellow tape around the site. Amanda Carter, then a young detective in the cold case unit, stood at the edge, staring at the car, resting on the tarp, flashing blue and red lights, glinting off the deep scars of rust. The driver's door was bent, jammed shut. A technician forced it open, crouched to check the glove compartment. They pulled out what remained of Teresa's shift log, waterlogged gray, the paper fused into clumps, crumbling as they turned it. Among the pulp, only the warped cover remained faintly legible, the ink nearly gone. Checkpoint 4 clear. Amanda knelt, touching the ruined cover, the chill of it sinking into her fingers. Then the technician pried a small object off the sun visor, a tarnished silver locket. The engraving, though worn, was still there. For MC, Amanda turned it over in her hand, catching the dull gray light. She looked down to the cliffs below, where the waves kept pounding the rocks, white foam disappearing as if it carried nothing at all. That car, forgotten for 13 years now, pulled back into daylight, brought only one silent question: who sent her over that edge? And why had no one seen it sooner? Below, the sea kept roaring, as cold as the secrets buried beneath. Cabrillo Highway reopened to traffic a few days later. The crews packed up their tarps. The cranes rolled away. But inside the San Mateo County Cold Case Office, the disappearance of Teresa Corwin was finally back in the light after 13 years. Amanda Carter spread the old file out on her desk. The cover was frayed, the pages brittle and stained, many stuck together from years of damp storage, the corners stamped in faded red evidence. The reports from 1977 were hurried, and sloppy ink blurred officer statements, inconsistent. And at the very end, the final line read dryly, "Presumed voluntary disappearance or suicide. Case closed." But as Amanda studied the photo of the Plymouth being hoisted up, she saw things that didn't fit. The front wheels were still locked in low gear, the parking brake fully engaged. The passenger side door was shut tight. The glove compartment hadn't been rifled through. If someone meant to take their own life, why lock everything up so neatly? And why was Teresa's wristwatch something her husband swore she never took off, nowhere to be found? She jotted one clean line in her notebook: stage versus accident. That afternoon, Amanda walked down to the vehicle impound lot. The Plymouth sat on a plastic tarp under harsh fluorescent light, the rust shimmering dully. She pulled on gloves, opened the driver's side door, and crouched to inspect the interior. The floor was damp and gritty, littered with bits of decayed paper, but the brake pedal bore a clear scrape, like someone had pressed it hard and held it there. On the passenger seat lay a sealed evidence bag containing warped fragments of the shift log fused into a solid lump, and the tarnished silver locket, its engraving so faint now it only read a single letter, M. She lingered there a long while, taking down notes, cataloging every small detail. A technician passed by and glanced in. "Case that old you, think you'll find anything?" Amanda didn't answer at first. She just closed her notebook and murmured, "Sometimes it's not what you find, it's what's missing." And with this case, what was missing spoke louder than anything she could hold in her hands: a reason. She took a long breath, stepped away, leaving the old car behind, cold and silent as the cliffs of Devil's Slide itself, waiting for someone to dig deeper into its darkness. The next day, Amanda Carter returned to the cold case office with a fresh stack of papers copies from the court archives. Officer statements from 1977 scene reports, even a handful of handwritten personnel memos. She laid them out carefully, highlighting each oddity she came across. The original report listed Teresa's last radio call at 0212, checking in at checkpoint 4. After that, silence. But in Sergeant Daniel Brody's statement, the supervisor on duty that night, he claimed, heard Teresa check in at checkpoint 5, though faint. Amanda paused. There was no such entry on the log, and no tape to prove it. She flipped further into the file. Under personal condition, someone had scribbled in messy handwriting, possible marital strain, unstable psychology. Unattributed. Yet in a private memo from the only other woman on shift that week, she'd written Teresa, told me her husband gave her a new silver bracelet last week. They seemed closer than ever. Amanda jotted in her notebook, character assassination. At the bottom of the pile, a black and white photocopy of the original search grid map caught her eye. 5 red lines traced the patrol team's paths that night. But the southern edge of Devil's Slide, where the car had been found, was completely outside the marked zones. Her brow furrowed. That gap had been there from the start. She called the radio archive room. A technician confirmed the tape from that night still existed. Never reviewed because it was labeled blank. That night, Amanda went down there herself. The tape clacked into the deck, a long hiss of silence, then faint static. Buried in the noise, a woman's voice came through, quiet but clear. Unit 46. Checkpoint 4 clear. Proceeding southbound? Silence. Then, after a long beat, a man's voice, low and cold. Stay off 5. Stick to 4. I'll handle the rest. Amanda froze her hand, gripping the table's edge. What Teresa encountered that night wasn't an accident, and it wasn't voluntary. A lie repeated for 13 years, and everyone had pretended to believe it. Amanda looked up at the board where she'd pinned the case, her eyes fixed on the web of notes. In the center, she picked up a marker and drew one dark line. Brody, that name, now sat squarely in the center of everything. 2 days later, Amanda found herself at a small coffee shop tucked near the Half Moon Bay harbor. The glass windows were fogged from the morning chill, muted light spilling across the room, catching on wisps of steam rising from mugs. The woman, she came to see Pamela Ortega, was already seated in a quiet corner. She looked worn, her eyes veined with red, the kind of eyes that carried something buried for far too long. Her name had appeared in the original case file, noted only as an anonymous 911 caller, the night Teresa disappeared. A single dry line in the log caller reported screaming on Devil's Slide. No follow-up, no statement, no interview. Pamela sat hunched, her hands gripping her cup eyes, fixed on the table, breath-shallow fingers trembling faintly with every gust of wind that rattled the door. Amanda said nothing. She simply placed the file on the table and waited. The space between them was heavy, filled only with the clink of a spoon against porcelain and the faint tang of salt air drifting in from outside. After a long silence, Pamela finally began to speak, her voice low and cracked, like she was reciting it to herself. That night, she had been driving home from her late shift, the road empty, her headlights sweeping along Devil's Slide. Wind howled against the car. From a distance, she saw the red flash of a patrol car's lights at the edge of the cliff. Slowing, she thought it was an accident. But through her windshield, she caught sight of Teresa, standing at the shoulder hands, raised as if someone was holding a gun on her. In front of her, a man in uniform, his back to Pamela, leaning in close, his posture sharp and threatening. Through the glass, she heard nothing but wind screaming. Then she saw him shove her. Clean, cold, no struggle, no cry. Just a single final motion, and Teresa was gone, swallowed by the cliff's edge, leaving only the sound of the surf crashing below. Pamela remembered the look on his face when he turned back the headlights, catching a mouth pressed into a hard line, eyes hollow. She'd never been able to forget, and she'd never dared to speak. When Amanda left the cafe, the shoreline ahead was a muted silver under the fog. The papers in her pocket felt heavier than usual, as though they carried the weight of the truth no longer hidden. The bay wind cut down the seawall, sharp and wet with salt. She stood there for a moment, her gaze fixed on Devil's Slide in the distance, the jagged ridges barely visible through the mist. In her mind, Brody's name was no longer just another suspect scrawled on a board. It sat squarely at the heart of everything, the thickest line of red on the map of this case. And with this testimony, every lie was finally beginning to fall apart. The following week, Amanda spent long hours before the whiteboard, dozens of documents pinned and strung together with red thread. Brody's name now sat at the center, surrounded by newly emerging connections. Names of former officers, suspicious account records, and a list of drug shipments quietly buried in internal reports over the years. Details that once seemed unrelated began to align piece by piece. The late-night shifts where Brody always coincidentally assigned Teresa to patrol alone. The trucks that passed through Half Moon Bay at odd hours, noted in the logs with vague, harmless remarks. A smuggling route running inland from the docks and bank statements showing unexplained cash deposits. The more she studied the board, the clearer the network became a machine that moved quietly with Brody, not just shielding shipments, but silencing anyone who dared get too close. That night, Amanda drove the length of Cabrillo Highway under a heavy gray sky. Fog from the Pacific crawled up the cliffs in thick ribbons, slicing through her headlights. What Pamela had described clung to her mind. Brody's hollow eyes, the gentle, merciless push. She pulled off at a turnout by Devil's Slide and stepped out, staring down at the black rocks below. The surf crashed white against the base of the cliffs, but somewhere down there, a part of Teresa still lay. The secrets yet to surface churned in the waves, waiting to drag down whoever reached too far. Back at her office, late that night, Amanda closed the door behind her, sat at her desk, and switched on the lamp. From her bag, she took the latest file, Brody's bank statements from the years after Teresa's disappearance. The numbers were too large to be a deputy's salary, regular monthly payments from a shell company on paper, registered right there at the Half Moon Bay docks. She pinned it to the board. In red marker, she drew a single line connecting Brody to a new name, Seaside Logistics. This network hadn't just hidden one death. It hid a whole rot embedded deep in the institution's bones. Amanda leaned back, staring at the board one more time, her eyes hard. With what she was seeing, Brody was no longer just a suspect. He was the key, and she knew that key would not come willingly. In the days that followed, Amanda quietly set the pieces of her trap into place. Every thread was already mapped out on her board, the dirty money tied to shell accounts, the buried witness statements, the timeline of that night on Devil's Slide. All of it converged on one name. That night, she sat alone in her office, the amber glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows over her notes. In the center of it all, a Polaroid of Teresa rested on the papers, her young eyes seeming to stare straight through the years, unblinking. Amanda nodded faintly, as if promising she wouldn't let those eyes close without an answer. The next morning, she signed a summons for Brody. On paper, the reason seemed routine clarification of financial records. No one in the office raised an eyebrow. To them, this was just another faded file who cared about an old suicide case. Brody arrived on time, walking into the conference room with the cold confidence of someone used to hiding in plain sight. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, his gray eyes cutting toward Amanda like she was nothing more than a junior clerk. She sat across from him, opening the file, slowly, her voice low and steady, as she outlined the discrepancies in the old report, the unexplained cash in the new records, the names tied to his network. Brody's answers stayed calm, almost rehearsed, a faint smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Until Amanda drew the final sealed envelope from her folder and slid the tarnished silver locket across the table. The engraving MC was faint, but still legible. His eyes faltered for just half a second. A flash of something panic crossed his face like a shadow. Amanda said nothing. She simply placed the final bank transfer receipt on the table, the one bearing his own signature from 1982, tying him directly to Seaside Logistics. The room fell quiet, but for the low hum of the air conditioning. Brody shifted in his seat, his arm inching toward the receipt, as if to cover it, his gaze darkening. He knew he was cornered. Amanda stood slowly, not looking at him anymore. She picked up the Polaroid from her folder, her fingers brushing across Teresa's face, then slid it back into the file. The board was nearly complete now, and the final piece was already in her hands. Amanda barely slept that night. On the board, the red lines had formed a dense web, and at its center, Brody's name was circled dark and heavy. There was nowhere left for him to run. The next morning, he was brought back into the interrogation room. Gone was the crisp uniform. Brody now wore a wrinkled shirt, his gray eyes dull like dust, long settled over an old case file. The room was cold quiet. Amanda sat across the table, the case file open before her, a stack of crime scene photos, an envelope holding the latest witness statement. She didn't rush. She simply opened the folder and let the silence stretch. Brody tried to hold himself steady, but his hand betrayed him a faint tremor when she slid the tarnished silver locket across the table. The dull glint of its surface caught something deeper in his eyes, the realization that what he had buried had finally surfaced. Amanda tapped the folder, turning another page. The bank receipts, Ortega's testimony, the radio recording transcript. Each piece placed together made the whole picture impossible to deny. Time seemed to crawl. His breathing quickened, his shoulders sagged, the smirk was gone. His head dropped, fingers lacing together, and then the words came halting, uneven. He told her about that night, about how Teresa had stumbled onto his smuggling operation, about how she threatened to report him, and how he saw no other choice but to silence her, about the shove, quick clean, and the ocean swallowing everything. When the last words left his lips, the room fell into a heavy silence. Amanda wrote down every word, her pen deliberate, steady. Then she stood gathering the files, slipping the Polaroid of Teresa to the top of the stack and closing it gently. At the door, she paused to glance back at him. Brody sat slumped over, hands still on the metal table hollow, now just a shell of what he'd been. Outside, the sun had begun to break through, pale light spilling through the frosted window, casting a cold, golden streak across the floor. The truth, at last, had been written. A few weeks later, Brody was formally charged. The courtroom was packed, all eyes fixed on him as he shuffled past in cuffs, head bowed. The press swarmed the story headlines calling him the Devil's Slide Killer in the shadows. But Amanda knew the trial was the easy part. She returned one morning to the small turnout on Cabrillo Highway, shrouded in fog. Devil's Slide loomed above her, waves still crashing at the base of the cliffs, white foam sweeping away and vanishing like nothing ever happened. She stood there a long time, eyes on the water below where Teresa had been lost. In her pocket was the final sealed envelope technicians had found lodged inside the seat frame of Teresa's car, overlooked until the very end. Inside was a scrap of paper ink, smudged but still legible. "If you find this, don't stop. There's more." She folded the note carefully and slipped it back into her coat pocket, her hand trembling slightly, though whether from the chill or the unease she couldn't tell. Back at the office, the board on her wall bore a bold red X through Brody's name, but beneath it, arrows still pointed outward, threads, still dangling questions, still unanswered. Amanda stood silently before the old Polaroid. Teresa's eyes from within the frame seeming to follow, her insisting she not stop here. She took a deep breath, closed her notebook, and walked out of the office, the door latching softly behind her. Outside, the sky hung gray and heavy, the coastal winds still howling, just as they had that night, keeping what no one had yet uncovered. And Amanda knew the journey wasn't over.